In this video, I will show you how to get started with particles using the molecule editor. Let's first start off by creating a new project. Let's call it particles. And I am going to place it on my desktop here. And I'm having my default template that is created for me, which is basically a scene, a camera, and a script to clear the screen. I'm simply going to move my camera back a little because my particle will be emitted here at the center. Basically, when we're dealing with particles, we're talking about two different elements. We got the particle network, which is basically the asset that is dictating how particles behave in space. And we have the particle system that is actually the object that is going to be placed within your scene. So let's start by creating a new particle network with the library selected under Asset, create a new particle network. And this time with the View 3D selected, we're going to go under Object, Add to Render Layer, Particle System, and we're going to select Template. Template will directly feed on the data that is held inside the particle network. For the other type, please consult the documentation. So I'm having my particle system that it's here. I am going to access its properties, and I'm simply going to drag and drop my particle network where it says network here. So basically now my particle system object is connected to my particle network asset. Now I'm going to jump inside the particle workspace, and I'm going to start defining how my particle network will behave. I'm going to select my new asset that I create, my new particle network asset. And when it comes to a particle network basically consists of at least one or multiple particle emitter. Think of a fire. Basically, a fire have a flame, which is a particle emitter, have some smoke, another particle emitter, and probably some sparks, which would be another particle emitter. For each and every emitter, you can basically tell how the particles will look and behave in space. In our example here, we're simply going to create a single one. We're going to go under particles, and we're going to change the type of particle to be point sprite, which is basically a GPU accelerated point, which is the most simple type of particles. For the other type, please also consult the documentation. The count, what is the maximum amount that specific emitter can emit? We're going to change that to something like 80/20 is a bit low. Next is basically to choose the type of emission, which by default is central. As you can see, we got multiple options here, to generate particle within a specific volume, within a geometry, along a wire, from another source, another particle emitter, and motion. We're going to leave that to central, and for the update rate, we're going to leave it at 0 Hertz, which means update every frame. Here, in this area, in my particle workspace area, I'm going to add a new modifier. The first thing that you want to do is basically add an emission. We want to emit particle in space, so we're going to choose the particle modifier to do that. Multiple options are there too. We're going to select spawn, which is the most basic type. The speed that the emitter will create a new particle, let's leave it at 1 for now. The rate, 20 particle per second. The lifetime, now for each particle created, each particle will have a specific lifetime in second. For this, what we're going to do, we're going to generate a random value, and let's say between 1 second and 2.5 seconds. So like that, we're going to have particle that live in space, for a relative period of time. I am going to jump in editing my render layer here, and as you can see, now we start to have a visual representation of our particle emitter here that is using central, and we can see that our central emission is actually pointing the wrong way. It is the right way, but we want actually as the Z is down, but we basically want these particles to go up in space and basically spread on the left, on the right a bit, just to have a bit of variation. So what we're going to do, we're going to rotate that of 180 degree, and now we're having our arrow that is pointing up. At this point in time, if I push play, basically I am and make sure that also I'm having wireframe, let's say shaded and wireframe, that is selected, so I can see actually particle in debug mode. But at this point, I am not seeing anything because basically the particles are emitted and just stay right here at my point, my center point here. So what I want to do is start to add actual data that is going to tell how those particles should interact in space. And for that, I'm going to add a new particle modifier that is going to specify my initial velocity. What is going to be the initial velocity of a newly created particle? I'm going to go under value, and I'm going to select random again to have a certain degree of variation. Let's say that I want the particles to move, to be emitted and goes on the left and the right a bit. So I'm going to select something like minus 0.5 on the X as a minimum value, minus 0.5 on the Y, and as a maximum value, I'm going to go at 0.5, 0.5, and now I already start seeing that my particles start to be created and now spread on the left, on the right. But this is not all. I want them to actually go up, and later on we're going to make them actually go down by faking some sort of gravity. So basically what I want to add, I don't want them to go too high, and I don't want them to go too low either. I'm going to specify that the minimum value would be 1 meter and the maximum value will be 2 meter. And as you can see now, I start to have my particle that start to be spreading in space. It's a bit light, the background here, so we're going to jump in coding, and we're actually going to modify the clear script that we're having here to be able to blend our particle. And let's change that to be a bit darker so we can see better here. And we're going to need to modify a few things here. Disable blending, we're actually going to want blending because we want these particle to actually blend in space. With that selected, I'm going to delete it. Connected back, stencil test we want, did it we don't want. Disable dither as well. Scissor test we want. We want to enable the depth test, but we do not want to enable the depth mask because we don't want those particles to actually overlap each other. We're going to draw them with alpha blending, and we don't want them to basically be drawn on top of each other. We want the color to be accumulated. We want to have additive particles here. So I'm going to remove that. And instead, I'm going to call, instead of having it enabled, I'm actually going to disable it. So I am going to disable the depth mask. So I'm still having depth tests. As you might already have figured out, when you're drawing particles, basically you're going to draw particles in a separate render layer. And after that, combine the result of that render layer, those particles that have been drawn in space, with your actual scene opaque solid objects that you're going to make, that you're going to blend together. I am going to connect that here. And now I'm going to specify the depth function is good. Cull face basically can be disabled completely because we are dealing with point sprite, and point sprite always face the camera. So we don't need cull face. I am simply going to move things around here, and now I am actually going to enable. I'm going to enable blending because I want those particles to blend. And I'm going to specify also that my equation, my blending equation, blend equation is add for additive. And now I want my blend function to use the source alpha, and the destination factor will be 1. So I'm going to have fully additive particles. So basically I'm all set up here with my camera, and this is basically the same kind of setup that you would have when drawing particles on a specific render layer. I'm only having one here in my scene. I'm only drawing these particles. But in a real life scenario, in a real world scenario, you will have multiple render layers and one dedicated, most likely dedicated for alpha and particle rendering. So with that set up, now I actually need to start drawing something. Even if my mode is shaded and wireframe, I need to tell those particles how to be drawn on screen. And for that, I am going to need to have a material. And I'm going to create a new material that is here. And I'm going to also, let's show the material, and I'm going to also need a shader. So I'm going to create a new shader. Here with the material property selected, I'm going to drag and drop my new material, and I am going to connect that shader. And I'm also going to want to have some sort of texture that is going to be applied on my GPU points. And I'm going to add a new sampler, add a new texture slot, and I am going to go under asset, next new texture, image, and I'm going to go search on my desktop here a single particle, nothing fancy, just a simple grayscale with alpha texture. I am going to import that, view texture, and I'm going to link it with my texture slot. Now, since I'm already having a code editor here, I'm going to edit my shader. I'm going to go under shader, and just to speed things up a bit, I am going to go copy some code here that is going to allow me to change the size of my point based on the current distance that I'm having with my particle. For that, I am using my eye position, and I am using my projection matrix to project the corner of that point sprite in space. And based on that, I will change its point size. Here you can see that I'm having an attribute color, and as you might have guessed, this is what we're going to set up next inside our molecule editor. What is going to be the color for each and every particle? And this is the data that will be sent directly to our shader. You might notice also that in this specific shader, I am not passing the texture coordinate. Since we're using point sprite, the texture coordinate is already calculated for us and accessible under the GL point coord here variable. So basically here I am using my sampler 0, which is my first texture slot here. I am going to use that texture to drive the appearance of each and every particle. That is going to allow me to get the alpha value, and then I'm simply going to apply the color that will be set inside our molecule editor, and I'm going to multiply the alpha. So like that, I'm going to have proper blending, proper alpha blending, and multiply by a color that I'm going to specify. With all that said, I am going to actually compile that shader, and I'm going to go back inside my particle workspace under my molecule editor. As we set initial velocity here, we're going to set also other things that is going to dictate how our particles is going to look like. We talk about the size of the particle, so we're going to also add a initial size for each and every particle. We are going to use a proportional value because point sprite does not have a scale x or y. They are basically just a single size. So we're going to use a proportional value, and let's add a bit of randomness. Let's say that our size of particle will be something not too big, not too small. Let's go for a value of about 0.0.5 and 0.1. Our initial size is set. Now we want to start also having a color. So we are going to go on this time under data. Initial data is the data that is assigned when the particle is created. Data is data that is changing over time, over the lifetime of that particle. And I'm going to select color, and I want to have a relative value that will be interpolated from when the particle is created up until its end. So it start with I start with a color and die reaching another color. I'm going to select relative, and I am going to add a interpolate. So from color, I am going to select like a golden kind of color, and I'm going to end with a NRG blue color here. And another thing that I want is basically when my particle is created, I want the alpha value to be at 1, and as it die and fade in space is going to reach 0. So I'm going to add a new modifier, data, and I'm going to select alpha. And similar as I did for color, I want it to be relative, and I want to have an interpolation from 1 to 0. With all that said, one thing is actually missing is to connect our material to our particle system. I'm going to go under the particle system properties, and I'm going to select my material. And now as I switch the mode to shaded wireframe, let's say just shaded, we start seeing that we have particles that are emitted in space and follow all the rules that we have set here. It's just the blue doesn't really show up as we would like. So what we're going to do for that, we are going to modify the way the alpha value is interpolated. We're going to use a driver, and we're going to set that at 0. So since it's relative, it's going to be from 0 to 1 when the particle is created, and 1 when the particle die. So I'm going to insert a keyframe here, and at 1, value 1, and at 0, and I'm going to insert another one here, and here make sure that we are fully, our key time is fully accurate. Let's set it to 0, let's set it to 1, and this one at 1, and it reached 0. I am now going to modify those handle for those keyframe, and I'm going to add it to free. No, I'm going to add this one to smooth, and I'm going to add this one to free, and I'm going to start cranking up that curve. And as I do that, you can see that now my blue starts showing up a lot more as my alpha is not overriding it here. And we can go even a bit more, and we still have like you know we have our alpha that is processing, in a more smooth way while the particles are disappearing, and it's increasing our overall color, giving us a nice looking effect. Basically, if I go to my camera and go a bit closer here, we got a nicer effect. Now, if you remember, we have changed the point sprite count here. And if we have our particle system selected and we check the number of particles, we're not reaching that number at all. We are actually around 30 something, near 40 particles. We can double that amount easily. And for that, what we're going to do, we're going to go back to our spawn particle modifier, and we're going to increase the speed so we can have more particles that are generated on a per second basis. I'm going to go with a value of 2.25. Let's see how it goes. Well, that's actually pretty good. You can see that here I am reaching my maximum amount of particles almost constantly. And this is exactly what you want. You don't want these particles to go to waste. You actually want to draw them on screen. And by changing the speed of the spawn, we can adjust here, as I put it, more low or more high. We can really reach, the maximum. Now it's too high. I constantly have 80 particles generated. What I want to find is a balance um, between the amount of particles that are alive and the one that dies. So this seems about right. I'm around 70 something, 80. So we got a good rotation of particles that are generated, created, and live and die. Now, one last thing that I want is actually to have those particles, because now they're just going up and they just fade and in space and disappear. I actually want them to go down, and for that, what I'm going to do, as I set an initial velocity, I am going to need to now add a force that is going to pull those particles down. And for that, I am going to change a data over time that is going to be the force. And I'm going to go on data and I'm going to add a force. And for the force, basically what I want is a proportional value on each axis. No, I actually want only on the z-axis. So I'm going to add a negative value here. Let's see, I have -1. Let's see how it goes. And now I start to have my particle that start to go down. If I drag in the positive, they're going up faster, and if I drag in the negative, as you can see now, we're having something like a fountain. And this is the kind of effect that I'm actually looking for, to have them basically start going up in space and then progressively go down as their lifetime expired. And as I have basically a invisible plane here, I don't want these particles to continue to be generated below my plane here. So I am going to tweak here my force to make sure those particles die about here. And this is basically how we are dealing with particles in general. More complex effects can be generated, but to get us started, this is basically the workflow that you're going to basically use to operate particles, create particles in space.